Good evening. I'm Phil Schomber. I'm the adult programmer here at Hedberg. I want to thank everyone for coming to tonight's program on Roy Chapman Andrews. I also want to take a moment to thank JATV. They are recording tonight's program and actually live streaming it. That gives everyone who can't be here physically a chance to watch it either live online or to catch it later on their TV broadcast or YouTube channel. So thank you to JATV. And now it's my pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker tonight, Steve Vavras. Steve is the president of the Roy Chapman Andrews Society, and he's going to be sharing some of the details of the fascinating life and adventures of this Beloit native. So with that, let me turn it over to Steve to get us started.
All right, how is the sound? A-okay? Okay. Well, thanks for that introduction, Phil. And to start things off, I'm going to be introducing the Roy Chapman Andrews Society to you, if you're not already familiar with it. And then we'll move into more of a discussion about the exhibit itself, which I hope you've seen. It's been up since the beginning of March. So for those of you who don't know, the Roy Chapman Andrews Society has been a Beloit-based organization. We've been around nearly 25 years at this point. And you see that the mission statement is to inspire scientific discovery by engaging with contemporary explorers who exemplify the legacy of Roy Chapman Andrews, Beloit's native son. So this organization is all about inspiring science and discovery and exploration. And we are run by a board of directors whose names are here, and we have a few members. In fact, Greg Gerard and Joe Stottleman are in attendance, and there may be others on this list who you happen to know either as Janesville residents or Beloit residents or area residents of the like. I also want to point out our critical two program coordinators, Ruth Carlson and Danica Keaton, who are sitting in the back. They really run the show, and the board of directors follow suit in many cases. So thanks so much to Ruth and Danica for keeping us going for so long. We are a membership-driven organization, so if you're not already a member, I encourage you to join. We have lots of different levels that you can support us with, and amazingly, we have this huge reach. I'm not sure quite how we're doing it, but we're getting members from all over. We have about 100 people. They're not all from Wisconsin and Illinois. We've got 20 states represented, 4 countries, and 3 continents. We have somebody from Australia, members from Mongolia, and of course North America. So, and those are the states we have members from. So please join if you haven't already. And what our organization is best known for is putting on the Distinguished Explorer Award event every year. And this award honors outstanding internationally renowned scientists and explorers. We've given 20 awards since this began 20 years ago. 2003 was our first one. And it consists of an award ceremony, an acceptance lecture by our recipient, a fundraising dinner, and then a student lecture that the recipient gives to area schools. And the goal, in green, educating and inspiring scientific discovery and exploration, fully in line with our mission statement. I want to introduce this year's recipient, who will be Sarah Stewart Johnson. She is a distinguished professor of planetary science at Georgetown University and also has an appointment at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. She does really interesting research, trying to find what she calls biosignatures of life outside Earth. So if you go to a place like Mars, what do you look for? Life may look very different elsewhere from how it evolved on Earth. So right now, she is engaged with other scientists looking for signs of life on Mars using the Curiosity rover, which is in the news all the time. And as training for this, she has explored the limits of life in extreme environments on Earth. Extreme deserts of South America, Australia, frigid and deserted landscapes of Antarctica. And the goal is to figure out how life can exist in these extreme environments. So if you can figure out how life does it and the limits of life in these extreme environments on Earth, it can provide clues of what to look for and how possible life may be elsewhere, like on Mars. So the big lead-in here is to our DEA award lecture and dinner afterwards, Friday, April 14th at 4:30 at the Beloit Public Library. It's a free lecture that she'll be giving called Contending with the Truly Alien, talking about her work studying for life on Mars. And we have a fundraising celebratory dinner immediately following at the Beloit Club. And critically important is that the reservations are due this Friday because we need a head count and order food in time for that. So we hope that you'll participate in both of those. The lecture is free, and the fundraising dinner we have information about, and the brochures, and we can talk to you afterwards too. So the history of this, I mentioned we have 20 or given 20 Distinguished Explorer Awards in the past. Here are our recipients. Last year's, the most recent one, was Phil Curry, who came from University of Alberta, and it goes all the way back to Michael Novacek in 2003. So we've had people from all different scientific realms be honored, and these are really heavy hitters in their fields, respective fields. And I'm sure some of you have been to these award lectures, and we expect Dr. Johnson to continue with that tradition of giving really engaging talks on her scientific research. So with that prelude, I want to now turn our attention to the exhibit itself. So how many of you, as I said, the exhibit's been around since the beginning of March. How many of you have gone through and seen the exhibit already, even at least parts of it? So at least half, but not everybody. So I'm going to hit some of the highlights and also fill in some of the gaps, things we didn't have time to cover or in as much detail in the exhibit. We've got 10 banners that represent different aspects of Roy Chapman Andrews' life. And those are shown here. Hometown Beloit, his early exploration in the 19-teens, his early work on whales, whale research, his early expeditions, Central Asiatic expeditions, his innovation. He was not just an interesting scientist and explorer, but he was also very innovative with the technology he used, which was very advanced at the time. He was also a great communicator, as I'll talk about tonight. And because of all these things, he gained celebrity status both here and nationally and abroad. One banner about his personal life, and then the legacy. Can't cover everything in the time we have tonight, and so I'm going to touch on all 10 of these themes, but the main focus is going to be Hometown Beloit, for obvious reasons with this group, his celebrity status, the exploration in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia, and then finally his legacy. Little bit of background about how this exhibit came to be. So it was, exactly a year ago, right, that we finished it, and in a scramble to be ready in time for last year's DEA celebration. And the way it came about was a couple summers ago, I got the idea that why don't we take all the information we have about Roy Chapman Andrews, got lots of photographs, lots of expertise, why don't we put this all together into some sort of a visual exhibit? And I naively assumed, like, how hard could that be, right? we got this stuff here. How hard can an exhibit be to put together? Well, it's harder than you think, and it required a lot of work. It required a lot of allies, and I want to take a moment to recognize some of the people and organizations who made this exhibit possible. It took money in addition to hard work. So we were able to get a grant from Wisconsin Humanities. They had a grant application process where they supported various nonprofits around the state. We made a pitch for this exhibit. They approved it. So that provided a big basis to start the exhibit. We also had financial support from State Line Community Foundation and the Nice Family Foundation, and then numerous people listed here with in-kind support and also hard work in various ways. Sarah Appleby, who I'll be talking about in a moment or later on tonight, is the granddaughter of Roy Chapman Andrews. She lives down in Texas, and she graciously lent and gave us various memorabilia items of Roy's life. And so that became part of the exhibit, and we'll share some of that tonight. Clive Coy, who works closely with Phil Curry up at the University of Alberta, has probably the largest collection of Roy memorabilia in the world, and he also graciously lent anything we wanted to go into these banners. Another person critically important with this effort, Ann Bossum, who is our real expert on Roy Chapman Andrews and gave the A version of the talk that I'm giving tonight at the library last year to introduce the exhibit, and she nicely let me borrow many of her slides, which you'll see tonight. So any questions you have that I can't answer, she can. She knows Roy inside and out and is his biographer as well. So this is the background. We got the exhibit together, went up last March, April, in time for the DEA at the library, and it's also going to be going back to the Beloit Library for next month, just in time for the DEA event. Here is, in a nutshell, a timeline of Roy's life. He packed a lot into his 75, 76 years on Earth, as I'll describe tonight. The first part of it here, his life in Beloit, I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on with this local audience. Work on whales is really where he shined and showed his promise as a scientist. Early exploration in various parts of Asia. Central Asiatic exploration, where he became most famous, as I'll talk about. And then he transitioned into more of an administrator, working as the director of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And then he had quite a long retirement, and he made good use of his retirement by continuing his work as an author. And he ended up publishing 22 books in his name. So he had quite a life, very active, as I'll talk about, and forms the basis of our Roy Chapman Andrews Society. And the thing that stands out is how throughout his life, he always had such a passion for exploration. And I'm going to show various quotes tonight that encapsulate that. This is one: "I was born to be an explorer. There was never any decision to make. I couldn't be anything else and be happy." And you see this again and again. This just came naturally to him. He couldn't stay inside. He had to get out, whether it was in the Beloit area or New York or Asia or wherever he happened to find himself. So another thing about Roy that continued throughout his life was his poses. I'm not sure where he learned this, but we have this photograph from when he was 8 years old on the left. And he was probably, 38 years old or so out in the field on the right. But notice he has this signature expression with his arm, which is the trademark of him. And so his face changed, of course. He became much more mature, but his pose was consistent throughout his life. So where did it all begin? Well, Roy was born in Beloit in 1884 on St. Lawrence Avenue, which at that time was really the western edge of Beloit. It's still on the west side, but in those days it was really pretty much the edge of town. And this is a picture of his house in, not sure which year, but it's certainly a lot older than today. But a recent picture of today, from today, shows the similarities. So you can definitely, as I toggle back and forth here, you can make out the front windows here and front door. And very similar to today, the side porch is still the same, and so forth. So even though they're taken at different angles, it's still very recognizable. Do you know what year this house was built, by any chance? Certainly before 1884.
I couldn't tell you, but it would have been some time before because he was the third generation to join the house. So it had been his grandfather's house before that.
Wow, so it's quite old. And we have up in the inset here, and you can see it in the picture, there is a tribute to him. So this is the birthplace of Roy Chapman Andrews, scientific explorer. So if you go by St. Lawrence Avenue, you can see it. Hopefully the inside's in good condition after his status living there. And not only was Roy born in Beloit, but Beloit is his final resting place as well. He died in 1960, and he's buried in the Oakwood Cemetery off of Milwaukee Avenue, and is very close, just a few blocks from where I happen to live. And what's always striking to me whenever I see this photograph or whenever I go by his stone is just how humble it is and just so nondescript. You could easily walk by it and not even see it. And here it is. It just says Roy Chapman Andrews, 1884, 1960. You can see it's lower than all the other gravestones next to him. And it's surprising for someone who was so famous and who was such a self-promoter that he would end up with such a humble tombstone. But anyway, there it is, right there in Beloit. So celebrity status, I'm going to talk a lot about that tonight. Why am I surprised that someone of this stature has such a humble tombstone? Well, Roy, when he died, his obituary appeared on the front page of the New York Times. Dr. Roy Chapman Andrews dies, explorer and naturalist, was 76. He discovered dinosaur eggs in Asia in 1920s and headed the Natural History Museum. So, wow, big deal. I mean, not many of us are going to end up on the front page of the New York Times when we die, right? So this gives you a sense of just how, what a celebrity he really was. Beloit College. So he spent the first 22 years of his life in Beloit, and he attended Beloit College, using in large part funds that he earned himself as a self-made taxidermist. And this is the way Middle College looked back in the day. Same building, but a very different facade than today, if you're familiar with that building on campus. And even though he ended up a really great writer and prolific, it turns out that he was a pretty average student. He was an English major. He was really more interested in doing other things than studying. He was into socializing, liked to play baseball. Of course, he was an outdoorsman, so he liked to be out wandering about, hunting, fishing, and whatnot. So he got by and got his degree. But before he did, something very, very important and tragic happened in his life. We talk about this some in the exhibit, but it's worth getting into a bit more. So during spring break of 1905, it was almost to this day, March 31st, he and his friend and instructor, professor at Beloit College, Montague White, went by the name Monty, he and Roy went out on a camping expedition right between Janesville and Beloit. And pretty normal thing to do. The problem was it had been a very cold and snowy winter, and it suddenly all melted. And so the waters that they were on in their canoe were very turbulent, very cold, very difficult to navigate. And what happened was that one time when things were especially rough, their canoe capsized. And Monty White, Professor White, drowned. He seized up from the cold in the water and ended up dying. And Roy describes how he saw his face as he went down in the water. And this made the Beloit Daily News, March 31st, 1905. Roy Andrews has terrible struggle in the water. Men were camping near Young's Creek and overturns while they were out on the river. And it was a terrible struggle for Andrews. It's almost impossible to believe he survived this in those frigid waters for so long. He finally was able to crawl out, reach a farmhouse, and get some help. But Monty White ended up dying. And through Ann's help and our former board member, Carol Mankiewicz, recently we were able to determine exactly where this Young's Creek is. It's not like a common name anymore. But here it is on the plat map of 1905. This is the bend in the river, and here's the modern location. So this is really close to Happy Hollow Park, just a few miles from here. I'm pretty sure this bend in the river is that bend, and which makes this Young's Creek by virtue of this, this plot of land owned by Young. And I think that this little creek here probably was the creek they were on. And just for some vantage point, this is Beloit Technical College and the paintball sign. So very close to here, obviously a very tragic experience. And Andrews didn't talk a lot about his early childhood and life in Beloit, but this made an impression, and he called it the first great tragedy of my life. It affected him forever, and it really showed him the dangers of exploring, that things could go badly, really badly. And it also gave him a feeling that he had a second chance, made him feel like he might be a creature of destiny. And I'm going to give an example of that from his autobiography, which Andrews entitled Under a Lucky Star, and gives you a sense of destiny. Because he does talk about that incident, that terrible accident, and also brings up the sense of destiny. So he says, it seemed so strange that he, Monty, the good swimmer, was the one to die, while I survived against well-nigh impossible odds. Still, it happened that way several times later in my life. And then later, he describes the impact that this tragedy had on him. It wasn't just short-lived. He says, my sorrow over Monty's death played havoc with my nerves. During the next few weeks, I lost 40 pounds. And the slightest excitement would set my body to shaking and twitching painfully. The tragedy left me with a nervous affliction from which I never recovered. Also, my hair began to come out slowly and did not stop until it was nearly gone. So you can imagine, at any age, this would have been a big deal, but especially when you're only 21, just to go through this. So the reason I bring it up is that it really did have an impact and shape Roy's thinking the rest of his life as an explorer. Another thing it did is it made him realize, wow, I had a second chance here, and I better make the most of it. So he kind of, after not taking full advantage of his college experience, he realized he needed to do something with his life. And his aspiration was to go to the American Museum of Natural History. He thought, given his interests in exploration and science, this was the place that he could make a name for himself. But when he got to the museum, there was no job for him. And that didn't deter him. He had a meeting with the director and said, look, I'll clean the floors. I'll do anything. Just, get me started. And after an exchange with the director finally relented and said, basically, okay, you can clean the floors. But Roy didn't stop there. And so that was his foot in the door, which he knew once he got in, he was going to make a name for himself. And sure enough, it didn't take long for the director and others to realize that Roy had a lot more to offer than cleaning floors. For example, with his interest in animals and taxidermy, he was assigned the job in the whale section of the museum and was told to work on this model of I think it's a blue whale, with others. And here's a picture of him from 1906, so right after he started. He started in the museum in 2006, and his early job involved whales. And not just making models of whales, but be careful what you wish for. He was sent out to Long Island, where there was a beached whale during the winter, and he and a coworker were given the task, I need you to go get that whale and bring back the bones to the museum, despite the incredibly difficult elements that they encountered. So, frigid waters, cold winds, and so on. You can imagine trying to take apart the meat from this whale and bring back the skeleton to the museum. So that's what he was tasked to do, and eventually he and his coworker did it. And years and years later, when he was the museum director, he had the benefit of the whale being presented at the museum, and so it shows this big transformation from beginning Roy, his very first years at the museum, to eventually the success he had becoming the museum director and having this beautiful whale skeleton to show. I should also point out that the experience he gained from his whaling work formed the basis of a lot of scientific knowledge, and he eventually used that to get a degree, a master's degree from Columbia University. So he took advantage. It wasn't just exploring. He learned a lot of the science behind whales and made some real scientific important contributions to the field. After the whaling work, he ended up going to Asia and traveling in various parts, Korea, Japan, China, Indonesia. And this is one of the early pictures here from 1912. So he'd been at the museum about 6 years now. And it's a picture of him eating with a group of Koreans. And this was a story here just to give you a sense of location. Roy C. Andrews has many thrilling experiences in the wilds of Korea, spelled with a C back then, and Japan, accounts of Beloit boys' adventures. And so he was there quite a while, and it was pretty out there in those days in 1912. And he was gone for so long and was out of touch for so long that he was presumed dead. And there was an obituary apparently written about him in the Seoul newspaper, and people back home talked about it. He was assumed dead, but he joked that he has died so frequently that he's become quite accustomed to it. So again, these apparent brushes with death, either real or perceived, another theme going on in his life here in his travels in Asia. He ended up using this experience to gain some stature by virtue of publishing in National Geographic in 1919, exploring unknown corners of the Hermit Kingdom, along with other authors in that series. He ended up publishing at least 3 times in National Geographic, making a name for himself as a writer. So that English degree from Beloit came in handy. But the way he's really made a name for himself was going to Mongolia and in China, but especially Mongolia and the Gobi deserts, and 5 different expeditions in the 1920s that he led and into 1930. And here's a map that shows the location of these various expeditions. And Mongolia was important for various reasons. The museum director at the time believed that Asia was the cradle of human evolution and wanted to find proof of that. And Roy, I'm not sure he really bought into that completely, but he was happy to go along if it gave him a chance to go to Mongolia 5 different times. And if it hadn't been Mongolia, it would have been somewhere else. And this is another one of Roy's quotes that I love. "I wanted to go everywhere. I would have started on a day's notice for the North Pole or the South, to the jungle or to the desert. It made not the slightest difference to me." So if that Mongolia trip or expeditions hadn't happened, he would have gone somewhere else and probably would have still made a name for himself. He just wanted to get out and see the world. But these expeditions in Asia were big time, as I'll get into, in part because of Roy's ingenuity. He was an excellent administrator. He was excellent at organizing people and logistics. And as I said before, he was a big innovator. And he would rely either on old-fashioned technology, like a camel for the expeditions, or if you look carefully in the background, you see this car. And he was innovative in deciding to use vehicles, automobiles, for his travels in Mongolia. And that was really ahead of its time in the early 1920s. notice that the camel is carrying a tire for the vehicle over here. So it's really an interesting comparison of the old versus the new, but I think it speaks to his resourcefulness and pragmatic nature. However it's going to work, I'm going to make it work. And so here you see the camels in a huge caravan in the Gobi. And, this could have been an ancient picture, right? I mean, camels have been traveling in that part of the world for many, many years. But then you see almost a mirror image of it in terms of the vehicles, the automobiles in their own caravan. And so just going back and forth, whether it was camels that were needed or whether it was automobiles, whatever got the job done, Roy was in favor of. Now keep in mind, these are 1920s automobiles, okay? So these are not Jeep Wranglers going off-road here. And so many people thought he was crazy for doing this, that the cars would never hold up, there would be all sorts of problems, he would just cause more trouble than they were worth. And yet he persevered, but sometimes the naysayers were right. So they did encounter lots of difficulties. They would hit mud, they would hit, sometimes snow, sometimes deep water, and they had to be resourceful about how to get out of some predicaments. You see Roy here, one of the people actually helping to push the car out of this deep mud. So it definitely was not all easy, and but he was determined, and so that persistence kept him going through these travails. Big payoff. So in 1923, his team came across the first nests of fossilized dinosaur eggs. This was really big international news. These were pieced together. Once they found the first one, they figured there's got to be more, and so they were able to come up with find all sorts of different eggs. I think these are oviraptor eggs. And you don't have to be an expert to see that those are eggs, right? You might have to be an expert to see that they're dinosaur eggs or figure that out. But this was something new, and it was something important because it proved how dinosaurs reproduced. So that's how they did it. They laid eggs, and it ended up that they laid them in a very particular way, which was also a big scientific discovery. So these are a set of eggs, and then this is one of the most iconic images of Roy out in the field holding one of the famous eggs and smiling. And one that is not commonly seen is this next one. When he was nearly at the end, as a 75, 76-year-old holding proudly his egg here. And this picture is, like I said, it's not commonly seen, and this came from the collection of Sarah Appleby, Roy's granddaughter. So this is one of the nice things that she gave to the Roy Chapman Andrews Society, and I like it a lot more than this one. This one is obviously staged and but famous, but this one, I think, looking back, almost picturing his life and what he was able to accomplish with those famous eggs. These discoveries, such big news that he became an international celebrity. And as an example of that, he appeared on the cover of Time magazine exactly 100 years ago. So the date here, October 29th, 1923, and he's got to be the only Beloiter to ever make the cover of Time magazine. I mean, this is really a big deal, right? And so it troubles me, I think it troubles all of us in the Roy Chapman Andrews Society, that there's still so many people around the area who don't know who he is, when in 1923, everybody in Beloit had to know who he was, and Janesville, and the whole region. And Time, in this story about him, really gushes. So it talks about the dinosaur egg discovery. Wildest hopes of the size and importance of fossil deposits have been confirmed. That was the headline. And then it goes on, Mr. Andrews owes his position as leader of the Asiatic expedition to a unique combination of scientific authority and practical resourcefulness. He is as thoroughly at home in these as the late Theodore Roosevelt. So wow, I mean, you get compared to Theodore Roosevelt as an outdoorsman, that's also a big deal. So I want to point this out, and he used his stature from this trip and the fame he gained to write another National Geographic article, Explorations in the Gobi Desert, with lots of illustrations. So if people didn't already know who he was, several years later, he described those adventures and those findings to a very broad audience. He also took advantage of his status by becoming a salesman. So I didn't realize until putting the exhibit together just how many things he advertised. So some of these came from Clive Coy's collection. So here he is advertising for rifles. Here it is whiskey. Here it is Dodge cars. And here it is oatmeal. What do those have in common, right? But basically, you name it, Roy peddled it at some point. And it's, you don't get to be asked to be the spokesperson for any of these unless you're famous and the company thinks that your name and your tribute can sell the products. And so you see things like, famous explorer Roy Chapman Andrews, great American scientist, makes breakfast discovery. So it's another example of what a big name he was back in the 1920s and beyond. He also leveraged his position to be a communicator, and he turned out to be a really good communicator. So in part, he was using this as scientists should to explain to the public about science and discovery. He also used it as fundraising because those expeditions cost a lot of money, and that money had to come from somewhere. And so he talked to private benefactors, he talked to general public audiences, he talked to all sorts of people. And here's just a few examples. Here he is at a lecture in Connecticut, Roy Chapman Andrews hunting the missing link in far-off Mongolia in, 1929. This is a colorful one in Los Angeles, 1935, with a dinosaur. Roy Chapman Andrews, famed discoverer, dinosaur eggs will tell of Gobi Desert experiences. And then, for several years, while he was museum director, he participated in an educational radio show called School of the Air, which was broadcast each week on CBS. And so this was a national audience. And in those days, radio was the thing. It wasn't even television. So lots of people heard it, and it was geared primarily for school children. So it was really an educational show about science, trying to get kids interested in science as well as adults. And so we do have a few snippets of that have survived. It's really interesting to hear his voice and to learn exactly what he talked about back then. Now, he ended up being a really good communicator and obviously a good writer, but it didn't come naturally. So when he first tried to convey the science of whaling to the general audience, the editor he took it to really criticized him. When Roy gave him a draft, the editor said, "This has the basis of a fascinating story, but you've obscured it with technical language that even I can only read it with difficulty." So he knew what he was talking about, but he didn't know how to explain it to anybody. And so this is an example. What follows next, though, is an example of how he persevered. So it wasn't like things were just handed to him. He ended up becoming a really good writer, and in terms of the whaling, he wrote this article for National Geographic in 1911, Hunting Whales, a World Industry, Roy Chapman Andrews, and then later in life wrote a book all about whales, one of the collection of his life. So, I keep thinking to myself that, he accomplished a lot, but so much of it was just sheer determination. And this is one example of how he wasn't naturally a great communicator from the beginning, but he sure made himself into one. And really, this is the tribute to him in terms of his accomplishments, in terms of literary accomplishments, 22 different books, autobiography here, Under a Lucky Star that I read from earlier. And it covers many, many years, all the way back from 1916, this whaling book, all the way to his final one, In the Days of the Dinosaurs in 1959. So 44 years worth of publishing. Many of these occurred after he retired and was still trying to make an impact on people. So if this was all he had accomplished in life, writing 22 books, that would have been a big deal, right? It's hard enough to write one, but the fact that he did this many on this many topics is bewildering. The reason he wrote so many, and the reason why so many people were interested in it, is because these crazy adventures that he described. And he says, in the first 15 years of field work, I can remember just 10 times when I had nearly really narrow escapes from death. And if you're keeping score, here's what they involved. So 2 were from drowning in typhoons. Our boat was charged by a wounded whale, nearly eaten by wild dogs, Roy and his wife. Fanatical Lama priests attacked him. He fell over cliffs. He was nearly caught by a huge python. And twice he might have been killed by bandits. So as many as those are, they still don't include everything. Because one time he shot himself accidentally with his gun and his leg got severely injured. Another time, in a Time magazine article I found, he was involved in bombings during the Chinese Civil War, and he had to hide under a boxcar to survive the bombs, and he didn't even mention that, nor does he mention the near drowning that he had in college. So, if you lose track of how many times you've nearly been killed, I think you've had a lot of near-death experiences, which makes for some incredibly captivating writing. And it wasn't just his own writing that was of interest. He was such an interesting character that he became the theme of 2 prominent biographies, one of which was written by Ann Bossum, Dragon Bones and Dinosaur Eggs, a photobiography of his life, and then Charles Gallenkamp, Dragon Hunter, Roy Chapman Andrews, and the Central Asiatic Expedition. So it wasn't just Roy writing about his own experiences that was of interest to people, but other people found his life interesting in retrospect and helped make a name for him as well. And of course, no mention of Roy and his celebrity status would be complete without a comparison with Indiana Jones. And many people have noted the similarities here between Indiana Jones and Roy. I don't think it's difficult to see them, both in terms of the clothing, the fact that they were both big explorers, went to Asia. Their hats are identical. They both had a fear of snakes. I mean, it goes on and on. And George Lucas has never said that that's true. He's never said that Roy Chapman Andrews was really the inspiration for Indiana Jones, but it's hard to see how that couldn't have been true, at least in part, because the similarities are so striking. So we're going to believe it if no one else does, but I don't think it's a difficult case to make. And finally, it wasn't only the popular culture that was interested in Roy and his celebrity status, but he also made enough scientific contributions that he was lauded by different scientific organizations at home and internationally. He's gotten medals from the Explorers Club, the National Geographic Society in this country, the Hungarian Geographical Society, as well as Sweden. And I believe we do have the medals here, right? So we can do some show and tell afterwards if you're interested in seeing those medals close up. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up this portion before the show and tell with a few takeaways. Like, okay, hopefully you've seen the exhibit. If you haven't, it's still around. You can take a look at it. You hear me tonight, you look at the exhibit, you think, okay, so what do I take away from all of this? So I boiled it down to 4 that struck me. So one, Roy was one famous dude. Okay, so I've been repeating that in different ways, but it really is something else, that a local person from Beloit ends up clearly the most famous Beloiter of all time. He really made a name for himself, and just for historical reasons, we should be aware of that, if nothing else. Another reason is that even if he hadn't been celebrated in his own lifetime, he just led this amazing life. It's almost fictional, really. I mean, when I've read through this Under a Lucky Star, I was sure some of it had to be fiction, right? Exaggeration to the point where this couldn't be true. But then, after hearing more and learning Anne's research, it turns out that these things have been verified, at least for the most part. And so, I just think he's this amazing person, lived this amazing life. Another point is that even though he self-described, he was seemingly destined for survival, born under a lucky star, his success was not guaranteed. Even getting a job at the Museum of Natural History was certainly not guaranteed. He had to beg for it and start cleaning floors to get his foot in the door. He wasn't a great communicator. The editor trashed him in his first writing attempt for public audiences, but he kept at it, and so he did it. I don't think he was a great public speaker initially either, but he sure honed that skill. And so, I think it's helpful too as sort of an inspiration, not just for his adventures and his scientific accomplishments, but also his perseverance. And then finally, the point that I think is most important for us today is that even though he's been dead for many, many years, he still remains alive as an inspiration for science and exploration. So that's the whole basis for the Roy Chapman Andrews Society. We do not want Roy to end up on a museum shelf somewhere and people forget about him, and when they do think about him, they think, oh yeah, he lived an interesting life, he was a big deal. We want him to continue as immortal as he can be by inspiring people today, and that is the whole basis for his legacy and why our society bestows upon internationally renowned explorers the Distinguished Explorer Award. And so here again are the 20 people who have been recognized so far. And our latest, of course, next month is Dr. Sarah Stewart Johnson. You see her credentials here. And again, please come to her talk Friday, April 14th at 4:30 at the Beloit Public Library. You'll learn something about the latest research on discovering life on Mars, which of course, if she succeeds, or she and others, it will be one of the greatest scientific discoveries of all time. No exaggeration. So that you'll learn the latest, how she's doing it, and what they're looking for in terms of life on Earth, or life on Mars. And then, as I mentioned before, the fundraising dinner, celebratory dinner at the Beloit Club. We had it there last year, terrific food, have it there again. But time is of the essence because the dinner tickets are due this Friday. So please, if you're planning to attend, please buy your tickets soon. Okay, so the show and tell. I don't know how you want to do this exactly, Ruth. We've got things lined up on the table here. Maybe you could just go around with the medals and we could kind of circulate them in the audience. We've got some close-ups here, thanks to Anne's presentation last year, who highlighted the different medals, the 6 medals that we'll be showing. So this one, 1929, from the Geographical Society of Philadelphia, I believe was the first. The Hubbard Medal from the National Geographic Society is a really big deal. That was from 1931. The Explorers Medal, 1932. The Explorers Club is still around today, also a really big organization. The Daly Medal for Geographical Research in 1935 from the American Geographical Society. And then a couple of international tributes, one from Hungary, Geographical Society of Hungary in 1936, and then the Vega Medal from the Swedish Society for Anthropology and Geography. So it wasn't just a big name in the US, but he also had lots of recognition internationally as well.
So everyone is asking what this buffalo is for. And I found out recently that...
Okay, thank you. In the middle, there's a silver looks like a buffalo. This is in recognition of the first Boy Scouts. Was it the Explorer that you get the award? The highest honor in Boy Scouts was named after Roy Chapman Andrews.
Is that right? Okay.
That was
know that.
pretty interesting.
Huh. Yeah, so these medals are courtesy of Sarah Appleby, Roy's granddaughter, and that was one of the items that she lent to us. And it's always nice to bring that out for show and tell. Better to see it in person. And I believe we also, Danica, we also have that picture of Roy with the dinosaur egg. It's taken shortly before he died in 1959 or early 1960. So I did show it in the presentation, but you see it close up there. Really nice photograph. Well, while we're circulating, are there questions or comments that people have? Yep, Nancy? Oh, Phil's asking to use the microphone because we're
Who's
broadcasting
listening,
it.
Thank you. Okay. I have two questions. I can't remember if the dinosaur eggs were soft or hard. And I'd also like to know if any children's books have been written about Roy Chapman Andrews, because children love dinosaurs.
Yeah,
and they're
for
the
sure.
ones who are growing up now.
For sure. Yeah, well, the dinosaur eggs were all fossilized, so I mean they were hard. You're wondering whether they were, back in the day, whether they were hard or soft. I don't really know. Do you happen to know? Or they were hard. Okay.
Hard but brittle, right? They were delicate.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't very strong structures.
Yeah, and in terms of the books, many of these were written for children. And I don't have a breakdown of which ones were and which ones weren't, but just judging from the cover, it looks like many of them were written for, all about dinosaurs, the whales. Just judging a book by its cover, I would say many of them were written for children. Is that true?
Yeah, all of those all about books were in a series that was science education. In the Days of the Dinosaurs was as well.
Mm-hmm. And probably, at least the first book was probably more technical, and then he became more popular.
Yeah, the rest were adult books.
Yeah. So you're right. I mean, this is the thing. Kids love dinosaurs. Adults love dinosaurs too. But this is using dinosaurs as a way to hook kids into an interest in science is a good strategy. Other questions or comments about Roy?
We also have a book back here that is all about strange beasts of the past. We also have the original manuscript handwritten by Roy Chapman Andrews that was leather bound by his son and it was dedicated to his granddaughter, Sarah Appleby. And she's the person who is obviously Roy's granddaughter and donated a great deal of her artifacts so that we can show you these exciting things tonight. So do come up and see. There's also a manuscript, leather bound, that is fishing and shooting notes. So if you can read Roy's handwriting, it's all in his handwriting. So it's interesting, as well as there are pictures here of Roy and his wife, Yvette, and various pictures of him where he was on some of his expeditions. And then there's a couple other books as well that I brought along that were written by Roy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the notes are a little hard to read because they are notes in his handwriting and then the age of the paper, but it is fun to see the work in progress. Uh-huh.
Are there any other grandchildren?
As far as I know, Sarah is the surviving member of the family, and so she's the one who was able to make the decisions to loan or in some cases give us the memorabilia, and some of it is actually going to be going to the American Museum of Natural History. So there's been negotiations there, and they're planning to do an expansion, and they're going to have a section that's going to feature, at least periodically feature Andrews, partly because of his exploring history and partly because he was the director there for many years in the 1930s. So it's appropriate. Oh, and then the binoculars.
So you've noticed the logo at various slides that Steve has shown. These are actually the binoculars that he took on those trips. So, and you can actually look through them and they do magnify still.
They work.
After all this time, they still work. So do enjoy those in the back as well.
Yeah, and there's some famous pictures of Roy, as well as in our logo with the binoculars. And so that was one of his trademarks, as well as how he posed. The pictures of him with his binoculars are very popular examples of him in the field. Hmm? Oh yeah, we need the mic. Thank you. You remembered.
Get my work cut in.
So I was wondering what drew Anne to Roy, and so I was hoping Anne could tell us.
I'm sorry, repeat your question?
What drew you to Roy?
Probably my kids. Someone asked about books for kids. The book I wrote actually was for kids. And I am also a graduate of Beloit College. And then I worked at Beloit College after I graduated, and that's how I learned about Roy, writing an article about him for the alumni magazine. And he's kind of got this ability he's sort of like a burr. And once he gets stuck to you, you can't ever pull him off. And so I have tried to resign from the Roy Chapman Andrews Society board periodically, and yet I come back and in other ways keep coming back. And I think all of us who encounter him find he's just irresistible. There is a magic about what he was able to accomplish, but also something very familiar, I think, to us as Midwesterners about his humbleness and his resourcefulness, and I think it just makes him endlessly fascinating. You can always learn more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, he's sort of a non-fictional, fictional character is what he seems like, as you know from documenting him. And by the way, so Anne is clearly the local historian on all things Roy, but the torch in some ways has been passed in terms of making that exhibit, because rather than burdening Anne with every request for material for that, we did burden her some, but Carol Mankiewicz, who's a recent board member, really took on most of the history and the text for the banners. So she and I were working together on it, but she really did most of the banners. And so she's somebody I'd mentioned during the part about the drowning, but I also want to point out that she really was the driving force for most of the material in the banners here in the library.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in too and say how exciting that's been for me to see other people. I'm becoming obsolete. Other people, you've delivered a fantastic talk, and other people are mastering the information in ways that just helps keep that story alive. It's important to have multiple people to be able to converse about Roy with the enthusiasm and the expertise that he deserves. And I'm so proud of what I see the Society do now and the board do. And this exhibit, if you haven't, I mean, it's the sort of thing you'll want to come back for, because it's more than you can consume in one take. And so pop into the library a time or two and take it in, or come down to Beloit and see it there. And the lecture will be fantastic. We haven't had a dud yet, and I can tell that the Society has chosen well with the next speaker. So definitely take it in. It's free, and it won't be nice weather. It's never nice weather. So so it's a great way to come out and meet a real explorer. And I guess one thing I'll add is, it may not be quite as true today, but when we first started the Explorer Award in 2003, it was kind of an inside joke that one of the unspoken criteria for the recipient was that they would have known the work of Roy Chapman Andrews. And we had so many people say, oh, I became an explorer because I read all about dinosaurs when I was a kid, or I read all about strange beasts in the past. And so that legacy truly does pass on through the generations. And one of our recipients was actually, I guess that's a different slide, but in 2008, we had the second person from Beloit, Mark Moffat, who grew up in the Beloit area and went on to become a leading explorer. And who knows what will follow as these scientists come to town and continue to talk to the young people of Beloit and us older folks too. So, sorry, I'll sit down.
Yeah, absolutely. The point is to keep Roy alive, and that's the whole mission of all of this. And in fact, Phil Curry, last year's recipient, became interested in dinosaurs because he said he found in a cereal box when he was 6 years old a little plastic dinosaur, and that got him interested in the topic. And then he learned all about Roy Chapman Andrews and his discovery. So there's an example of someone who was really big time, who got his start as a child, and he was inspired by Andrews.
Just, you're probably going to touch on this, maybe I don't want to steal your thunder, but in the process, we also make it very well known that to our students in the area, and all of our explorers do give lectures to the students from grades 5 through 12. And since COVID, we've been able to do them virtually, and it gives a lot of interest to people who don't live in this area, but they can still see it virtually and participate. And the other part that we do with the students in high school, we have sponsors who sponsor students to come in and enjoy every part of the Distinguished Explorer Award event by coming to the lecture. They have a private meet and greet with the award recipient. She or he signs a book for them that they have written, and then they attend the dinner to be seated with business and community leaders so that they can get a feel for what business and that is all about, and hopefully ignite some interest in them to become explorers. And last year, an interesting story, Phil Curry was our award recipient, and we had a little girl come up. She must have been 8 years old. She was dressed in a dinosaur dress, and she said, "I want my book signed by Dr. Curry because I'm going to be a paleontologist one day." So it does ignite some interest in students, and that's part of what our mission is too, to help create the next generation of explorers.
Well put, Ruth. Thank you. Anything else? If not, thanks so much for your attention and your time. Oh, one more?
Was his childhood home turned into a museum?
It was not. People are living there, and so the closest thing to a museum piece is the sign out in front. So it recognizes that Roy Chapman Andrews used to live there, but no, it's a house being used today. A very old house now. Okay, well, thank you all for coming.